Hello, MCU fans! So it's been about a year since I did a video on the multiversal timeline, and a lot has changed. Not the least of which is I am firmly convinced that a variant of David Hasselhoff's Nick Fury showed up in Deadpool and Wolverine. So, lots to discuss. Let's dive right in, see what we can find out. So, the most important consideration when putting together a multiversal timeline is deciding how you feel about Loki's tree, basically Universe 616, and how it relates to all the other universes. I'm a firm believer that Loki's tree is separate from those universes, and that basically factors into my overall multiversal timeline. And I'm not going to go into why I think that, because you can check out this longer video, which goes over the entire history of the multiverse. But for this timeline, I'm going to have Loki's tree separate from all the other universes. It's also important to note that Marvel has been assigning numbers whenever they show us a new universe, and I'll definitely be using those numbers throughout this video. It's also important to note that when you jump between universes, you arrive in each universe's present day. What I mean by that is when Deadpool jumped from his universe, 10005, into 616 to visit Happy Hogan, he arrived on March 14th of 2018. Now, because 10005 and 616 are synced with each other, in other words, they're running at the same present day, he left his universe in March of 2018 and arrived in 616 in March of 2018. But that's not always the case. For example, in Multiverse of Madness, this screen certainly seemed to imply that Doctor Strange arrived in 838 in 2021, even though he left the main MCU in 2024. So that's interesting. But really, we've seen a lot of that during the Spider-Verse movies. Each of the characters have a different time frame for their universes, whether it's 1933, 2099, 3145, you name it. Also, we saw during No Way Home that Venom left his universe, 688, in 2020 to jump into the main 616 in 2024. And then Fantastic Four is a perfect example. Their post-credit scene is in July of 1969, but it sure looks like Doomsday is going to be in December of 2028. And I love the fact that Matt Shackman tried to make this as simple as possible. He said, in their version of the world, they're in the 60s, but different universes are of different ages, right? And so when they cross over, they won't be time traveling. In other words, they go to each other's universes present day. Totally makes sense, right? And actually, this concept of eternal inflation fits perfectly with why I believe each of the universes are separate, but also why they have different present days. The theory of eternal inflation basically says once it starts, it never stops. And therefore, we get all of these different universes, whether you call them pocket universes or parallel universes. They're each separate, but each have a different present day. And so now, with all of that said, we can jump into the multiversal timeline image. And I know, it's monstrous. It looks confusing. Please don't shut down the video. Hang on. I promise we're going to zoom in to each area in detail. But what I want you to see here is there's different sections for each universe. So we have 616, the main MCU. Here we have the TVA and the What If episodes. Here's 838, which of course Doctor Strange visited during Multiverse of Madness. Here's all the Sony Spider-Man movies. Here's all the Fox X-Men movies. Here's all the characters that showed up during Deadpool and Wolverine. Here's Fant 4-Stick, which I really don't know what to do with right now. It doesn't really connect to anything, but I'm holding out hope we might get a maker appearance during Secret Wars. So I'm keeping it on there for now. And then, of course, here's the Fantastic Four movie. So yeah, it all fits together really nicely, but then we're going to zoom into each of these things in detail. However, one last thing I want to mention, I'm only including the shows and movies that show up on the Disney Plus timeline. So that means Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is not included in this video. However, I do have timeline videos where I show how Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. fits within the overall MCU. So like here's the beginning of their timeline continues here, and then finally continues here, and I absolutely love Season 7. It's just such a good show, and hopefully they will ultimately put it on the Disney Plus timeline, but for now I'm keeping it separate. Also, I'm keeping separate all of the Hulu and Freeform shows, but I have a timeline for those. I've got timelines for all of the different news stories, TikToks, etc. And I even have timelines for the Spider-Man and X-Men animated shows. So lots of different timelines you can check out if you're interested. But now on to the main multiversal timeline, everything that is connected together. So we start with 616, and here we have basically phase 1, a little bit of phase 2. Notice we start all the way up in the upper right-hand corner with Eyes of Wakanda way back in 1260 BC. So then we move on to the rest of phase 2, and notice we do have all the Netflix shows in there. And then we move on to phase three. Once again, more of the Netflix shows, but also we have our first intrusion from the multiverse, and that is in Deadpool and Wolverine when he comes to visit Happy Hogan. And notice we're going to have dotted lines anytime we're jumping from one universe to another. So now we move on to phase four. We get more multiversal shenanigans. Here we have the Loki variant being pruned and taken to the TVA. Here we have the Spider Bros, the villains, even Venom jumping in and out of No Way Home. Here we have Multiverse of Madness, where Doctor Strange visits, of course, 838. Then we move on to phase five. We continue with the multiversal shenanigans, where we have the TVA investigating what happened during Quantum Mania. And we have Monica jumping over to what I believe is 10005, because I cannot imagine they're going to have multiple X-Men universes during Doomsday. That would just be crazy, right? And finally, we move to phase six. Now, notice I do have Avengers Doomsday down there. The only 616 characters I have connecting to it are Thunderbolts, because obviously we got that post-credit scene, but there will be a lot more connections coming up as soon as we know every character appearing. But I do have lines coming in for both the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, because we know they're going to be showing up. All right, so now we jump over to the TVA and Loki. Notice here we have Loki being pruned from Endgame and showing up in Loki Season 1. Here we have the Spider Bros going in and out of No Way Home. And here we have Doctor Strange jumping over into 838. Then we continue on with both What If and Loki as we head to the next section. Here we can see Loki Season 2, as well as What If Season 2 and Season 3. Here we have the line representing the TVA investigating what happened during Quantumania. Here we have Monica jumping over into what I believe is the 10005 universe. And then here we have the TVA jumping into the Deadpool and Wolverine movie. And what's interesting is Monica goes to the X-Men universe in 2026, but the TVA actually show up during 2024 in Deadpool and Wolverine. So yeah, they're actually going to a point before Monica showed up. Nothing is ever simple with the X-Men universe, right? Okay, so now we jump over to the Sony movies. We have Tobey's movies, we have Andrew's movies, and then we've got Madam Web. It doesn't seem to connect to anything, but I don't want to leave it off, so that's why it's kind of just floating out there. But then we have both Tobey and Andrew, who will eventually show up now in No Way Home, right? Leaving their universes. So here's lines for them as they're heading towards No Way Home. And then as they get closer to No Way Home, we actually have the Deadpool lines as he's going in and out of 2018 in 616, right? And so then finally we get to the point where Tobey, Andrew, and Venom all come from their respective universes and head into No Way Home. And then we haven't seen Tobey or Andrew show up again, but I'm sure they're going to be in either Doomsday or Secret Wars or maybe both. And then here we have Venom returning back to his universe. And then I think Across the Spider-Verse has to happen after The Last Dance, because Across the Spider-Verse references the events of No Way Home. And then notice in the upper right-hand corner, we have the Caught in a Ham one-shot, which of course shows how Spider-Ham was able to arrive during the Into the Spider-Verse movie. And then finally, to round out the Sony movies, we have the Kraven the Hunter movie, which doesn't really directly connect, but has a lot of Easter eggs to the previous movies. And then here's a line for Monica heading over to the 10005 universe. And then here's a line for the TVA, who will eventually show up in Deadpool and Wolverine. All right, so we've certainly mentioned the X-Men universe a couple times now, so now it's time to finally discuss how it fits into everything. So I'm going to show it in a horizontal fashion first, because it's easier to understand everything if you look at it this way. And I will mention that I prefer the OG trilogy to be in the 90s, but even if you put it in the 2000s, it doesn't change much in the overall timeline, so it's just a minor thing. So, of course, we have the first timeline, which starts with First Class and goes all the way to Days of Future Past. Wolverine then travels into the past, and now we have the second timeline. That second timeline runs all the way to 2054, when then Cable does time travel and gives us our third timeline. Then we see Deadpool doing all kinds of crazy time travel at the end of Deadpool 2, even going back to visit the original timeline and shoot the crappy Deadpool, right? That was awesome. And then finally, I do believe that at the end of Deadpool and Wolverine, the entire universe is recreated. That basically takes care of things like the fact that Mystique died during Dark Phoenix, and it takes care of the fact that there would be two Wolverines in the universe otherwise, and it explains why they've all changed to wearing comic accurate outfits, right? So then finally, we have the newly created 10005 universe, and then we have the Marvels happening in 2026, which of course includes Monica showing up in 10005. I'll also point out in the lower left-hand corner, Legion isn't really connected to anything, but I want to keep it there with the rest of the X-Men stuff, so that's why I've included it down there. All right, so now we can flip it to be vertical so it'll fit with the rest of the multiversal timeline. Of course, we start with October 1962, X-Men First Class. Here's our OG timeline, which runs all the way down to Days of Future Past in 2023. Oh, but then we start with the time travel shenanigans, right? Wolverine basically travels back to 1973. Of course, X-Men First Class is also in this timeline, but now we're in the second timeline. And then that's going to take us through Deadpool, No Good Deed, New Mutants, and Deadpool 2. We then get the revised future from X-Men Days of Future Past, the Logan movie, and then in 2054, now Cable's the one doing time travel. So that takes us back up to Deadpool 2 in 2018. Of course, we bring in the New Mutants and everything up above it. Then Deadpool does all those shenanigans at the end of the movie, lots of time travel, right? But then he next shows up in Once Upon a Deadpool, and it's right after that that he does his little visit over to 616 to see Happy, and then here we see him coming back. And then I firmly believe we're still talking about the same 10005 universe, so that's why I have the line going through the X-Men Days of Future Past, the new Happy Future, right? And then finally, Deadpool shows up in Deadpool and Wolverine. Here we have all the characters in the Void showing up from their respective universes. Here we have the TVA popping into 10005 in 2024. And then at the end of the movie, of course, we have Deadpool and Wolverine completely resetting 10005. I think that's important because it eliminates the two Wolverines and gives us the new anchor being that we saw in the movie. It brings Mystique back from the dead, and it gives us the comic accurate outfits that we see in Doomsday. But also, it's those same outfits that if we follow down, that we now are going to see in the post-credit scene for the Marvels, right? That's why Beast was wearing the comic accurate outfit that we saw. Also, here we see Monica Rambeau coming over to 10005. And then, of course, here's where the X-Men will be crossing over with 616, as we'll see in Doomsday. It's also worth noting, here's the TVA, and again, this stresses the fact that they showed up in the 10005 universe before Monica showed up. Pretty weird, but hey, again, it's the X-Men universe. It's crazy. All right, so now we look at all of the different characters that showed up in the Void during Deadpool and Wolverine. But here's one of the big changes. We have to add some more space because, yes, I am convinced that David Hasselhoff's Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., did show up in that movie. Why do I say that? All right, so this is the infamous TV pilot with David Hasselhoff appearing as Nick Fury, right? In fact, I did a video on this. You can check it out if you want to know more about it. But okay, here's the key. During Deadpool and Wolverine, way over there on the right, you can see a character that pretty much looks like Hasselhoff's Nick Fury. So we got this real helpful Instagram post. You can see him there standing in the crowd. But here's what's weird. In the post, they flag him as Erg. So I'm like, wait a minute, Erg? So let's put them side by side. This is the character that showed up, half of him at least, showed up in Deadpool and Wolverine, and that's Erg. I mean, they both have an eye patch, but notice it's not even on the correct eye. But other than that, they don't look anything alike, and they don't have the same powers. Instead, if we put him next to David Hasselhoff's Nick Fury, they look very similar. In fact, notice the shoulder strap there, and notice the belt buckle, the leather. Oh yeah, he is totally Nick Fury. And in fact, Disney actually released a copy of the script, and notice what it says about Cassandra's henchman. Well, right down in the middle is Nick Fury. So yeah, I am convinced that that is David Hasselhoff's Nick Fury, and I love it. So yeah, these are all the different characters that showed up in the Void during Deadpool and Wolverine. Of course, we've been discussing Nick Fury's Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. We have Daredevil and Elektra's movies. Then here we have all the Punisher movies. I'm including all of them because they joked about there being 5 different Punishers. Plus, we saw the Russian from Thomas Jane's movie, but seemingly the weaponry from Ray Stevenson's movie. So yeah, I'm just going to include all of them. Then here we have the Blade movies and the show. And then finally, the Fantastic Four movies, because of course, Johnny Storm showed up. So yeah, this is all the different characters. And again, I have timeline videos for every one of these movies and shows if you're interested. So then we have all of their lines as they're heading towards Deadpool and Wolverine. And notice I just kind of combined the 3 Punishers into one line. Here they are continuing to head down. Then they take a turn to the left. And finally, they show up in Deadpool and Wolverine. So yeah, that's awesome. Now then we jump over to Fant 4-Stick, which I'm including for completeness, but right now doesn't really connect to anything. Really hope the maker shows up in Secret Wars. And then finally, we have the 2025 Fantastic Four movie. Now, what I'm doing with this, and in fact, let me pull in this July 1969 part. What I'm doing with this is we know that they jump from July of 1969 over to Doomsday, which is in December of 2028. And then we can use this information to go backwards up the MCU timeline to see what was happening at each of the different points during the movie. So, for example, if we go all the way to the top, At the beginning of the movie, that's kind of happening during the 2019 timeframe when everybody was blipped in the main MCU. So pretty cool. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that and I'm going to push the 1969 portion down lower. In fact, let's see. Well, it's really lower, right? Way down. So they're all the way down to here. And then now we see them jumping out of their universe and making the long trip over. Here they're joined now by the X-Men, right? And they make the long trip all the way over to appear in Doomsday. So, yeah, there you go. That is a deep dive walk into that entire diagram. In fact, now let's go back to the diagram, and it kind of makes a little more sense now, right? In fact, I do have this on my Google Drive, and you can zoom in and get much more detail or zoom out and get a wide shot like this. So, this is really helpful to have it all in one image. But one question that comes up is okay, would you actually watch things in this order? It's kind of up to you on how you want to watch things, but I do think something interesting to note is all of the X-Men universe is basically happening prior to Deadpool showing up in 2018. So you could argue that even though the X-Men universe went all the way to 2054, all of the resetting, etc., all the branches are actually happening prior to when Deadpool finally shows up in 2018. So that's why I have everything jammed so high at the top there, because I want to sync 10005 with the point when Deadpool goes to visit. So, yeah, really cool to see how this all lays out together, and then it lets you decide what the best watch order is for you. So, in addition to that image being on my Google Drive, I also have this Google Sheet, which has all of the information across the entire multiverse. Notice that it's sorted by timeline month and year, but you can actually sort by release month and year if you're interested in doing it that way by going up and choosing your sort. And there's also a filter which you can use to get rid of things like flashbacks, or if you don't want to see multiverse stuff, you can get rid of that. But it's really nice and convenient and lets you look at everything. So check it out. Let me know what you think. And if there's anything you think I have wrong in it, let me know and I'll definitely get it fixed. So there you go. That is the entire multiverse timeline in one giant image. I really, really want to know your feedback. Tell me if you like it, if you hate it, what you would change, etc. Because you know I love to read and respond to everything. And don't forget, June contest, be a subscriber, leave a comment. You can win a book or a steel book. And we have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out. Plus, I always love to mention the Discord, and here we are in the metaphysics section. You know things are always going to be hopping in there as we're trying to figure out the entire multiverse and how it all connects. Plus, we have the Doomsday Countdown Watch, every day listed here at 7 p.m. Eastern. We watch a different movie or show as we head towards the December 18, 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 2,700 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.